C'est bon?
Attends, moi je vois. Tu vas t'installer.
C'est bon. Je peux y aller? Okay, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you for being with us for the third IRNIST webinar. We have the pleasure to welcome Derek van Rheeren. Derek is an associate adjunct professor at the University of Berkeley. He is director of the Athletic Study Center. He is faculty director of the cultural study of the sports education. So today he will speak about sport tourism, the controversial bathroom bill, and political turmoil in the US. The speaking will be around 40 minutes long, and of course you can ask questions. You just have to write them in the part under your screen. Where you see me now, you will see the PowerPoint and Derek in just a few minutes. So, welcome to the IRNIST network. Please have a look to the site, and if you are invested in sport tourism, please register. It's free and without any commercial purpose. So, maybe we will have some technical problems, so thank you for just waiting a minute, if so. Derek, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Please.
Dear colleagues and friends around the world, I'm very excited to be back at Université de Lille. I'm appreciative of the tremendous welcome I have had from my friends and colleagues here as well. And I'm excited to talk through this webinar today on a topic in sport tourism that focuses on social sustainability. And my presentation will begin essentially with a conceptual model, and then I'm going to pose a couple of questions which I will work through. I'll need to provide some context for the United States political system, which I think we probably all would agree is in some case of turmoil at the moment. And I want to speak about the impacts that this is actually having in a very specific way around sport tourism. So I hope that there will be some questions at the end of this presentation, and I look forward to spending some time here in the next hour with all of you. The title of this webinar is Sport Tourism, the Controversial Bathroom Bill and Political Turmoil in the United States. 2 years ago, or no, more than 2 years ago, I came to Lille and I gave a talk on the role of human rights in mega sporting events. The talk was called Skunk at the Garden Party, the Sochi Olympics, State-Sponsored Homophobia, and Prospects for Human Rights through Mega Sporting Events. During that presentation, I focused on what I considered state-sponsored homophobia in Russia. I'm turning the table now as an anthropologist to look at my own country, the United States, and return to the notion of state-sponsored homophobia and its impacts at a more local level and state level on sport tourism. In that paper, I defined sport tourism locations as sites of political struggle. And I'm going to use the same conceptual frame of critical social theory to look at sports as a realm of ideological struggle, with tourism events as heightened areas of conflict. Critical social theory reveals that what counts as a human right is contested and must be negotiated. It's not a given, despite the fact there are efforts to make it universal. while, as the second bullet here says, while modern sport embodies ideological struggle broadly, sporting events often heighten political struggles in a particular place in time. There is an important body of work on place or space in the literature at large, and with sport tourism research specifically. I'm not going to get into much detail about the literature during this presentation, other than to say that social geography to a physical space, there is a social geography to a physical space based upon movement to and through these spaces. There's also a political mapping of geographic space, as evidenced in the United States by what we call red and blue states. Needless to say, the social and political aspects of place impact travel to and from these places and impact tourism as a practical and theoretical concept. So, of course, as such, it impacts also sport tourism. In this presentation, there are two broad guiding questions. I wouldn't call them research questions because I don't have an empirical answer to these questions. It's more at this point an analysis and a looking ahead and opening up a dialogue with those of you around the world. So these questions are essentially, do sport organizations have a right, or furthermore a responsibility, to respond to the social policies in a given location, particularly relative to these organizations when they're hosting sporting events or activities? This is not a new question, but an interesting one at this moment in time, because my contention is, at least in the United States, there is a greater role that these organizations are playing in political activism. So the second question is, has the active role of sport organizations in political discourse increased recently? And if in fact it has, why is that? What are the factors leading to this change in political engagement? I won't go into much detail other than to say, in many of the last conversations many of us have had in Zagreb, in Coimbra, here in Lille, we've used examples from particularly mega sporting events to demonstrate that there is a number of political and social issues that are focused on these sites. As I said, in Sochi, I talked about the laws there that preceded the games that many of us in the West would consider discriminatory for the LGBT community. In Qatar, we certainly know about the migrant worker issues. In Rio, there were any number of issues that were at stake during both the World Cup 2014 and the most recent Olympics. I won't go into detail other than to say that these are obviously sites where these struggles take place. There's a conflict between a global responsibility for citizens of the world to protect other citizens of the world versus the imposition of particular cultural values. One of the biggest and most important efforts to define universal values was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. But more recently, in 2011, the UN endorsed guiding principles on business and human rights. And both the IOC, through the Olympic Agenda 2020 and 2030, as well as FIFA, have come to address the need to quite articulately and clearly state their positions vis-a-vis human rights. In the IOC's agenda, in particular, we're talking about issues and changes to what they're calling Host City Contract 2024, anti-corruption and sustainable development standards. So what some states or nations consider liberal interventionism based upon identity politics, others see as a moral imperative to protect fellow human beings. So let me turn the focus to the United States for a moment, where at the moment we're having a very interesting debate around individual rights. Individual rights in the United States are very much cherished, but these rights come into conflict when we think about non-discrimination versus religious freedom. Both individual rights, but can come in conflict. And ultimately we have to negotiate which values are more important in a given community, and who ultimately gets to decide which are more important. And I'm going to use the example here, again, of the LGBT community, or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, because there have been, particularly under the Obama administration, a number of changes that have made this group a protected class that cannot be discriminated by under law. But again, this comes into conflict with other people's belief systems relative to religious freedom as an individual right. A little background on the way in which governments ultimately work. And in this case, the United States has an interesting distinction around how policies can be made. And they can be made at three levels. They can be made at the national level, the state level, and the local level. As I noted, American political ideology values very much individual freedom. And as such, in our Constitution, the system of government tries as best it can to place power as close to the individual as possible, which would lead one to believe that the local governments, in many ways, should be driving decision-making and policy-making. But we know that the state and the national governments have particular roles within decision-making. So the national government, for example, is charged with foreign policy. The state government oftentimes is charged with education, although the national government engages in that as well. The local government will be involved in particular transportation decisions. But in terms of just decision-making, it's actually a fairly complicated process, and it's also one that highlights the, again, political struggles that take place around given issues. So let me talk about the particular bill that I'm going to use as the example about how sport tourism is being impacted in the larger sector of tourism. So this is a bit of a timeline. Charlotte, North Carolina is the capital of a state in the United States, and it itself added a non-discrimination bill or ordinance that protected the rights of this community. Soon thereafter, the state itself of North Carolina, who had a Republican governor and a strongly Republican-controlled body, passed a bill that overrode Charlotte's ordinance. It itself is called the bathroom bill, or, as we'll see, I will talk about in the next slide, what it says. But it wasn't long thereafter that the federal government came in and basically said that you can't pass that bill as a state because it discriminates against a group of protected individuals. So the Department of Justice sided with the local government against the state. This has posed an interesting situation. The North Carolina State House Bill 2, which is HB 2, or the bathroom bill, states the following. In state-operated buildings, individuals can only use the restrooms and changing facilities that correspond with the sex identified on their birth certificate. The bill also prevented localities from passing their own non-discrimination ordinances, essentially saying that the state will control who is or is not discriminated, and they will define discrimination law, and it will not belong to the local government. This is an an interesting situation because it pits people who believe that this is discriminatory against, particularly in this case, transgender individuals, and those who feel they have either religious freedom or they feel are protecting, in this case oftentimes framed, girls and women from sexual predators. Let's talk about North Carolina for a moment. This is a state with a population of just under 10 million residents. It's almost exclusively Republican and has been for the last 50 years. It is a state that voted for Donald Trump in the last elections. I should say, however, it was also a state that voted for the first term of Obama. The second term they voted against Obama. But to put it in perspectives around tourism spending in North Carolina is over United States dollars, 25 billion annually. So there's a lot of money that comes through North Carolina. It's, I think, the sixth largest amount in the states. What have been now specifically the sport tourism impacts? And I was talking to Claude and Serena at lunch about how much of a factor is sport tourism relative to all of tourism in a given state or country or wherever we're focusing. It's very unclear how that is calculated, but what we can say is what people are writing about just the impact of sport tourism dollars based upon this piece of legislation in North Carolina that I've just discussed. As a result of this piece of legislation, the National Basketball Association, or the NBA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I'm from San Francisco Bay Area, so my team is the Golden State Warriors, which is the best team in the world. Of course I'm biased, but it's true. Actually, it didn't win the last year's championship, but it should have. But they decided, based upon this bill, to relocate the All-Star Game of 2017, and they moved it from Charlotte, North Carolina, to another city, in this case New Orleans. Soon thereafter, the largest organization for college sports in the United States, a huge organization, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or the NCAA, pulled all of their championships in this year, 2017, from the state. One of the conferences that's in the National Collegiate Athletic Association, where North Carolina resides, also pulled all neutral site championships from the state. And ESPN, the Sport Entertainment Network, stated, "We embrace diversity and will evaluate our options." What does this all mean? Well, this is how it's being framed from one of those organizations, the NBA. And I'll read this, and hopefully you can as well. But what's important here particularly is that these sports organizations are claiming they have a set of values, that they are reflective of the players, the fans, and the people at large. This comes into conflict with state decisions, local decisions, federal decisions. What's also interesting about this particular quote, and I will read it, is that the NBA is framing this not as an American or national issue, they frame it as a global issue. They state, since March, when North Carolina enacted HB2, or the bathroom bill, and the issue of legal protections for the LGBT community in Charlotte became prominent, the NBA and the Charlotte Hornets have been working diligently to foster constructive dialogue and try to effect positive change. We've been guided in these discussions by the long-standing core values of our league. These include not only diversity, inclusion, fairness, and respect for others, but also the willingness to listen and consider opposing points of view. Our week-long schedule of all-star events and activities is intended to be a global celebration of basketball, our league and the values for which we stand, and to bring together all members of the NBA community, current and former players, league and team officials, business partners, and fans. While we recognize that the NBA cannot choose the law in every city, state, and country in which we do business, we do not believe we can successfully host our All-Star festivities in Charlotte in the climate created by HB2. So they're claiming that this is a hostile climate for people who represent what they stand for. The Center for American Progress has estimated that already North Carolina has lost $86.3 million as a result of this bill. Others have projected that the losses have been as high as almost $400 million. If the law remains intact, which it does currently, the Center for American Progress is estimating additional monies, 250 or more, from the NCAA, NBA, ESPN, that Charlotte hotel revenue could ultimately cost them over $15 million, and Raleigh, another city in the state, will lose potentially $24 million. The loss from the All-Star game being moved cost the city of Charlotte and the state of North Carolina $100 million. There are a number of other ways in which costs are being leveled because of a political decision that also is playing out in the courts. If you look at economic losses by type, one sport business professor said that there are essentially four. One is the loss of new spending by non-North Carolina residents. One is the loss of new spending by non-local organizations. There's the leakage of spending by North Carolina residents, which essentially means that if a North Carolina resident wanted to go to the All-Star game, they're going to go to in this case, New Orleans and spend their money and not spend it in the state. And of course, less money created through the multiplier effect. And since there's less money from non-residents coupled with a greater leakage of money from North Carolina residents, there's less money available for these multiplier effects. That is, there's less business-to-business spending. If hotels receive less revenue, they're less likely to respend locally with other businesses like catering, laundering, etc. And the employees of negatively impacted industries, like hotels and restaurants, will have less income to respend locally on other things, such as movies, malls, or museums. Other economic impacts outside of the sports tourism area have impacted jobs. PayPal, Deutsche Bank, CoStar have opted not to open up businesses and or central offices in the state of North Carolina, costing thousands of jobs and ultimately millions and millions of dollars. At this point, more than 130 businesses signed a letter to the governor opposing this legislation, and they wrote the following, much as the NBA wrote. The business community, by and large, has consistently communicated to lawmakers at every level that such laws are bad for our employees and bad for business. We believe that HB2 will make it far more challenging for businesses across the state to recruit and retain the nation's best and brightest workers and attract the most talented students from across the nation. It will also diminish the state's draw as a destination for tourism, new businesses, and economic activity. It's a lot of people speaking out against this law. If you take an example of a very small town, Cary, North Carolina is a city with approximately 160,000 citizens. But it's a unique city in that it has invested in building venues or locations to host sporting events, despite the fact it's a very small city. And places like that have intentionally invested in the sport tourism industry are particularly impacted by these examples. So they have hosted 24 college championships since 2003. You can imagine if the legislation is kept and the NCAA pulls all of its championships, they're going to lose a lot of money, and this city needs that money. It's contingent upon the success of their sport tourism industry. So you can look at a very local place in a state and see what the implications are and the negative economic impact, let alone social impact of such a situation. There are also cultural outcomes of this. It's forcing politicians to align on one side or the other with this bill. And this is, again, the bill is only an example of the way that sport tourism ends up becoming political struggle in a given place in time. In some places, the pressure from prominent athletes and from large sports organizations is actually setting the policy, or certainly helping to set the policy. An example of this is in Georgia, where the governor basically spoke out against the similar legislation that was being proposed for the state of Georgia, and some of that came from pressure from athletes and from the sports organizations. On the flip side, you have the governor of Texas, who basically said that under pressure from the National Football League, who came out and said, we're going to review in the future where we decide to host our Super Bowl. The governor, who's a Republican, said the NFL needs to concentrate on playing football and get the heck out of politics. Back in North Carolina, a Democratic governor has just won over a Republican governor, and he's not quite sure how to navigate the situation with this bill. This is actually a global issue, because this issue of LGBT and transgender issues has actually had to be confronted by organizations such as the IOC. This became very clear several years ago when the issue of gender verification gained global attention after South African runner in the picture here, Caster Semenya, was ordered to undergo sex testing after winning the 800-meter world in 2009. She was eventually cleared to compete and won silver in the 800-meter at the 2012 London Olympics. But under the previous IOC guidelines, approved in 2003, athletes who transitioned from male to female, or vice versa, were required to have reassignment surgery followed by at least 2 years of hormone therapy in order to be eligible to compete. Now, surgery will no longer be required with female to male transgender athletes eligible to take part in men's competitions without restriction. It's different for male to female transgender athletes who will need to demonstrate that their testosterone level has been below a certain cutoff point for at least 1 year before their first competition. The issue is clearly having to be addressed by sports organizations, and they are in turn gaining a role in the political agenda. My new president, who I didn't vote for, is ultimately now bringing the national government back into this dialogue. So the Trump administration has now indicated a shift away from Obama's perspective on transgender student policies. And what the Supreme Court, which just this past week was asked to decide whether school districts can order students to use certain restrooms, has sent the case back to a lower court. So the federal government now doesn't want to deal with this. They've made it clear that they disagree with Obama's perspective. And what is interesting from the perspective, in my notion on this webinar, is how now will sports organizations respond because the federal government has changed its perspective. If you recall, under Obama, you have a federal government supporting a local non-discrimination ordinance against the state. Now you have a federal government essentially supporting the state's rights to make these decisions. This is, in my estimation, a recent development. In some of the work I've done previously, and others have done, generally large sporting organizations have been very apolitical in their perspectives. Of course, the organizations themselves are incredibly political about who gets to basically be on in their leadership, ultimately where hosting rights are decided, and so forth, but they have tended to not want to weigh in on anything political. They've kept their distance on political issues. This is a change in this current state, just within the last year, I would say. Sports organizations are beginning to weigh in on political decision-making. And a question I have moving forward is, why are they doing this now? Why is this happening at this moment in time? Several explanations are possible, but perhaps they are more sensitive to the concerns of athletes. Perhaps they are concerned more for their fans. As such, it may be really a business decision as opposed to any particular social justice perspective. The other question would be, are they responding to pressure from outside organizations, such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or the media, for that matter? Some have argued that were it not for Amnesty International and the work that they did in Qatar, that the issues of migrant workers' rights and exploitation, and generally in the Kabbalah system, labor system overall, would not have been so heavily scrutinized. So are these organizations for human rights actually having a greater impact today than they have in the past? What seems to be clear, at least again in the case study of the United States, is that the the sports organizations have become more political. What are the implications for sport tourism? Well, one, as we've seen, there's a major economic impact. Not only will this ultimately decide potentially where hosting rights will take place, in the case of North Carolina, we see that it's more of a boycott that is taking place, and the boycott has financial, economic implications, major losses to local communities and to the state community as well, and obviously budget. The second implication has to do with structural uncertainties, meaning that the decision-making process now is really unclear, and the distinctions between local, state, and federal governments are consistently being challenged, and they're being challenged by stakeholders in the sports realm, both, at least in the United States, the professional and the collegiate sport organizations, who have a significant amount of power themselves, particularly a power in steering public opinion. And finally, the implication of social sustainability seems quite clear in the sense that human rights is going to be a factor moving forward around sport tourism events and activities, but it has to be coupled with the local and the national focus on other rights of individuals, i.e. religious freedom and political freedom as well. So we have to question, how will these types of decisions be made in the future? Will the pendulum swinging in the United States more to the right, which is happening in a lot of places in the world these days, will it impact also the activism, the political activism of these sport organizations, or will it give further emphasis for these organizations, such as what's happening with the IOC and FIFA, to actually take a stand on human rights protections? As I say, I'm not sure I have the answers here, other than to say that I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I would welcome any questions, any comments, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Derek. So, I propose that now we see the question who are asked to our speaker. So please, Orsholia, and in the same time I thank Orsholia Seglesi because she's the one who organized the technical part of this conference, and it was a big deal.
I would second that. Thank you very much for your role in this and for your management of this webinar.
Okay. So, what are the questions, please? Just a minute.
Something happened.
We're back on.
Thank you. Question, comments, please feel free to contact. No, that's the end of the... Just a minute, please. Questions are coming.
We hope they're coming.
Yeah. We have questions. Just maybe you can read them. It will be easier.
We have a thank you from Irena.
Thank you to Irena for being with us. Yeah. You. I saw you had a question.
I have one.
Okay.
Should
please.
I ask my question?
Yeah, please.
We have a real question. Has been somebody do the investigation of personal profiles of people proposing the strong laws, the strange laws? You can't. No.
No. Okay.
Let's see.
What is the question, please?
Oh, I see. Has the investigation of personal profiles of people proposing the strong laws? I'm not certain I understand the question. Is this looking, it may be that the question has to do with the, in the actual local or state governments where these bills are being written, ultimately who is making those decisions. And it of course depends upon whether we're talking about the local region or the state region. In the case of this bill, it was authored by actually state politicians that, in their estimation, we were representing a more conservative perspective, political perspective, that was based more, again, on religious freedoms and protection of individuals. But the protection was not of what people who were more open-minded, let's say, or liberal, would say was a protection of human rights. They were, as I had said earlier in my presentation, protecting young women from potential predators. This is an issue that often comes up for those who are anti-LGBT, where there is a corollary or a connection made, falsely made, I would argue, between people who are have different gender identities or sexual orientations and sexual deviance such as pedophilia. And there's often a case among particularly conservative perspectives that think those two somehow automatically go together. There's no evidence to demonstrate that at all.
Another question?
I'm waiting for other questions. If there is no other question, I have one.
Okay.
So you said that sport organizations became more political, and I was just wondering that does it mean that there is an even historical shift from the relation of sport and politics, as sports used to be a tool in the hands of the government to show their power, later to to show their good citizenship. They show how they are greening as a country, how they are became good citizens, and now it became more like a tool in the hands of businesses. And like this, are they indirectly guiding social changes?
It's a very interesting question. Of course, sport is a big business itself, so I think there is a way in which it has gained greater independence from state or national governments, particularly in certain nations. I do think there are still nations that use sport very much as a tool for nationalism and patriotism and a particular set of values. I think in the case of the United States, we have a similar situation happening in the sports business world, where you have oftentimes conservative owners, conservative political owners, who are very, very wealthy. We consider them in the 1% of wealth, but the individuals who are playing for them as these prominent athletes have a different set of political views. So I believe there's been a balance and a shift in power where the unions of players who represent a different set of values are gaining greater strength. And so it doesn't allow the owners to be so forceful in their positions. I also think that sports, generally organizations, are very much trying to promote issues of fairness and inclusion and non-discrimination. And so if that's what they claim they are that they stand for, and those are their values, then they have to have and take a political stance when something seems to be clearly discriminatory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Any other question?
I'm surprised there aren't more questions because it's sort of a controversial topic. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's like, I don't know if I want to get involved in this one.
Okay.
But after all, I am a Berkeley professor.
Okay, so thank you very much, Derek, for this very, very interesting communication. Our colleagues don't ask any more questions, so we will finish now. Thank you to everybody having participated to this conference. I will send you very soon. Somebody says that it is difficult to discuss via written text and not directly. Oh yes, maybe. Okay.
Migliora le forum.
Yeah, and so I remind you that this communication will be on the site. It will be available through the cloud or
through the IRNIST site.
Through the IRNIST site anyway, and so you can listen or re-listen it. And I will send you new messages in a near future, giving you news from the International Research Network in Sport Tourism, and for a new conference probably before summer. So thank you everyone, and see you later. Thank you, Derek. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.